Joining us, we're going to get started in just a moment, just one moment. You want to start gathering your seats? For those folks joining us on Zoom, we'll be starting in just a moment.
She earned a BS in marketing, a BA in communications from Kane University, and an MS in organizational dynamics from the University of Pennsylvania. Ms. Gaston Williams is the Managing Director and Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at BlackRock, the world's largest asset management company. She's an award-winning global diversity executive, author, activist, producer, and philanthropist. With more than 30 years of experience as an advocate for equality in corporate America, and a thought leader around diversity and inclusion. Michelle is a seasoned diversity practitioner with experience working in consumer goods, pharmaceutical, professional services, and financial services. As the former Managing Director of Inclusion and Diversity for Accenture North America, Ms. Gaston Williams provided strategic direction, thought leadership, and development of an inclusive environment by integrating diversity practice into all aspects of business. She has also held positions in global responsibility, human resources, and product development. She is also the recipient of multiple community service awards and accolades for her work as a diversity practitioner. She has been recognized by Black Enterprise as one of the top executives in corporate diversity for 2019, 2018, and 2017, and recognized as a member of the Diversity Woman Elite 100. The Reverend Al Sharpton recognized Michelle as a 2016 honoree at the National Action Network Woman of Power, an honoree at the Black Institute Awards Gala in New York City, and a 2015 Ebony Magazine Power 100 honoree. In recognition of her many achievements, Kane awarded Michelle an honorary doctorate. And these are just some of the many honors she has received in her career. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you tonight our amazing guest speaker, Ms. Michelle Gaston Williams.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Frankie. And good evening, everyone. Okay, you can do a little better than that. Good evening. Good evening. I drove all the way from Manhattan. I know you can do better than that. Okay, it is my sincere pleasure to be here with all of you this evening. And it's certainly my privilege to be back at Kane University, where I graduated many years ago. But it's also a place that allowed me to better understand who I was as an individual and also predetermined what I would become years later. And while I was here, I prophesized that I wanted to be an executive at a multinational organization. I didn't know what industry it was going to be. I didn't know where exactly it was going to be. All that I knew is that I wanted to be global. I wanted to work for a very large organization, and I wanted to leave a place in better condition than when I entered. That was the goal. And what I will say to you is that Kane University allowed me to do that and prepared me for that. So I'm extremely delighted to speak with you today, and congratulations to those of you who are going through the DEI certification series. What I will also share with you is Kane is forward-thinking to have such a series. There are very few universities or colleges or institutions on the planet today that has such a program. And for someone like me who's been leading DEI for a number of years, I'm looking for my successor. I'm looking for the next generation of chief diversity officers. So again, it is a privilege to be here with all of you. So as Frankie alluded to in the intro, I'm what you call a lifer in this work of DEI. I've been a practitioner for a little over 30 years of my professional career, and I've had the privilege to work in several different industries and for some very large multinational organizations like Accenture, where we had 650,000 employees worldwide. That was part of my responsibility. Or Novartis, at that time they had 350,000 employees worldwide. I spent 10 years of my career working and living in Switzerland, Basel, Switzerland to be specific, leading DEI for two multinational organizations. And as Frankie mentioned, I now work at BlackRock, the world's preeminent Wall Street asset management company, comprised of over 18,000 employees in over 30 countries around the world, and with assets exceeding $10 trillion. $10 trillion. So I know, right? So I have the pleasure to do the work that I have loved for the past 30 years at one of the top financial services institutions on Wall Street. And as a CDO, I'm described as a strategist, a transformational specialist of sorts, a change agent, and a constructive disruptor. I like that, a constructive disruptor. But this work is less about the chief diversity officer and more about the organizations and companies that we work for to make them bigger and better and bolder and faster by creating workplaces and cultures and environments that are fair, equitable, and conducive for every single individual to realize their ambition, but also to realize the business objectives for that organization. And also, to set a zero tolerance policy and tone against harassment, discrimination of any kind, and where we harness the unique qualities that we all bring to the table. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is what most companies value. And BlackRock is no different in that respect. Now, I chose to join BlackRock in September of 2020 for a number of reasons. Primarily because I was convinced during my interview process with the members of the Global Executive Committee, and that would also include Larry Fink, our chairman and CEO, our president, Robert Capito, and a host of others, that this is an organization that really wants to get it right. That this is an organization that wants to accelerate the pace of change in DEI. And as I've mentioned in a host of a number of forums over the years, including my most recent presentation to clients and also to the members of Congress. I was invited in December by Congresswoman Maxine Waters to come and to represent the company and to talk about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the asset management industry. And one of the things that I mentioned in my talk is that there are several things that I look for in an organization. And there are several things that I will ask the leaders of that organization before I even set foot in there. And that is, do you have the courage to act, the commitment to lead, and the conviction to change? And if any of these three things are missing from that conversation, I tend to look the other way, because as you can imagine, in 30 years, I've seen the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that indifference on this particular subject serves no one. And so, BlackRock, like any other organization on the planet, is invested in progressing in a meaningful way on DEI, and I really wanted to be part of that transformation. So as I take a step back and I think about and reflect on the evolution of DEI in 30 years, we've gone from what I would describe as a movement and not a moment in time, where we're actually reacting in real time to what transpires in society. Now, I continue to be impressed and, more importantly, inspired by the unwavering leadership and steadfast commitment that I've seen across industries over the past 30 years. I've seen movement with a real sense of urgency around issues pertaining to the workforce and culture. All are key performance indicators of success in DEI, and that's how we measure DEI internally. But I've been most impressed by the relentless focus to ensure that DEI is not just simply about doing the right thing or relegated to just the optics of what diversity represents versus what it feels like to those who have been historically marginalized or underrepresented in the workforce. And although progress is being made across industries, and it has, there is a lot more work to be done. So I am encouraged. And what I will tell you is that this is a moment, this is a movement and not simply a moment. So it's my understanding that Dr. Baker talked recently about the role of communications in DEI, which is extremely important in terms of how to facilitate potentially challenging conversations And this work will evoke challenging conversations. And Dr. Foreman talked about how understanding our identity and our past helps to approach conversations around DEI. So my goal today is to connect the dots and to make this work real and pragmatic for you so that you can lead this work effectively and promote the constructive disruption that this work evokes in practice. So the question becomes, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Now, unlike diversity of yesteryear, many companies have evolved from what was to what I'm now calling diversity 3.0, as we have now integrated the E in equity into our work, which also symbolizes the maturity in this space where we're not just focused on diversity in all the ways that we differ, and inclusion, which really speaks to a welcoming environment where every single person thrives in that organization and feels a sense of belonging. But equity is the most important factor in the equation. Whereas we're now starting to take a step back and realize and re-examine policies and workplace practices to ensure that there's fair access to advancement and opportunities, and ultimately fair outcomes for all employees and for the business overall. Now, equality symbolizes the equal treatment of all employees. That is the goal. And this requires an intentional focus, a crisply articulated business case that makes sense and that is embraced by all employees, and a strategy that is holistic in nature and not just squarely focused on just the composition of the workforce, because this work is far greater than just the composition of the workforce. You have to integrate it into every facet of your institution or organization in order for it to become effective and in order for it to work. So you have to understand and articulate how and why DEI is good for business. And there are a number of white papers and scholarly articles to substantiate this claim, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. And if you did not believe in the business case, I don't think many of you would be sitting in this audience today or participating in this certification program. So DEI matters. Many organizations have been on a positive trajectory like BlackRock, which has resulted in material progress year over year on DEI efforts. And with the convergence of societal injustices like the George Floyd incident, and more recently a global pandemic, the conversation, the discourse, and the engagement of racial and social justice inside and outside of the workplace, this conversation has increased exponentially over the past couple of years, more so than I've ever seen it before in the 30 years that I've been managing DEI. And in recent years, there's been an increased level of consciousness around inequities that plague underrepresented communities. There's been the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, Asian hate crimes, anti-Semitic attacks, attacks on the trans community and individuals in the LGBTQIA communities, and the list goes on. And in some cases, these inequities have made their way into our workplaces. These incidences across the global business landscape has resulted in a call to action like I've never seen it before. There's been an uptick in terms of the commitment on behalf of most companies and industries, which has led to a more focused effort around recruiting and retention and transparency and accountability. There's also been a number of public declarations that have been made and pledges that have been made by institutions and corporations. They've adjusted company policies and increased transparency around their DEI goals, which are now being tied to performance management systems. So there's a lot going on in this space. So the question becomes, what more do we need to do in order for individuals to get the point? At what point does the Chief Diversity Officer role become non-existent. Well, it probably won't be non-existent in my lifetime. I've spent 30 years doing this work, and I would imagine that it will take another 30 more at the pace in which we're going in order for us to see and to accelerate change. There's also a heightened level of expectation on behalf of employees, prospective candidates who are entering our workplaces, clients, regulators, just to name a few. So the business case is clear. And the stakes have gone up both internally and externally for most organizations. The societal incidences that have occurred over the past, I'd say 18 months to 2 years, that was the inflection point for a lot of organizations and institutions. And the commitment to DEI has become even more essential. And many firms have risen to the occasion to ensure that DEI is a critical business enabler and not just simply the nice thing or the right thing to do anymore. Commitments have turned to actions, and we're now starting to see the constructive disruption that is required to accelerate progress. Now, the role of the Chief Diversity Officer is to facilitate that progress. There was a Harvard Business Review article, and I believe even more recent, the Wall Street Journal had a similar article which talked about the criticality of the role of the Chief Diversity Officer. And essentially what they said was that in corporate America, the Chief Diversity Officer role is the most coveted role that exists outside of the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO. 95% of Fortune 100 companies has a Chief Diversity Officer. And there are specific skills that are needed in order to do well in this space. Strategic agility, problem solving, effective communication across all levels within an organization or institution. That is key. Influence, the art of persuasion, compassion and empathy, courageous conversations, analytical rigor, and the list goes on and on. But what I will say is the most critical skill of them all is effective communication. And so what I will say is that being a graduate of this institution has certainly helped me to become bigger, better, bolder, and faster in terms of how I think about this work and to effectively work with some of the best and brightest CEOs in the world. An effective global DEI strategy is one that is global with local relevance, depending upon the geography or the country and the local legislation. Now, diversity has a very different definition depending upon where you are in the world. You have to customize and localize your strategy accordingly. And what I can tell you is that DEI is not a priority everywhere in the world. And the common definition of diversity globally, the common denominator, is gender. It's how many women work in the organization or institution. 50% of the world's population is comprised of women, so that makes sense, right? The other dimensions of diversity that I spoke of earlier, like race and ethnicity and LGBTQ and ability or disabilities or religion in the workplace or generational diversity, all of those things don't get the same level of attention. And we're trying to change that. So as mentioned earlier, I've lived in Switzerland for 10 years, and here's a picture of where I used to live in Basel. And it was challenging in some ways, but it was certainly one of the most rewarding experiences of my entire career. I've actually lived in Switzerland. I've spent time in Istanbul, Turkey. I've also spent time in Hong Kong, and I've traveled to over 40 countries around the world in my career. And as a Black woman, living in a country where I didn't look like the locals or my colleagues, or did I speak the language, it definitely was a challenge. But I was up for the challenge. Now, clearly I stood out in society. I was one of the first women and Black professionals to have an executive position at a company reporting to the chairman where I was employed in Switzerland. Now imagine this. I lived in a municipality where women did not have the right to vote until 1984. 1984. So here I was, an American, a Black American, a woman sitting in the C-suite, 2 offices down from the chairman of that company. So as you can imagine, I've been mistaken for the hired help. I've been mistaken for the administrative assistant. I've been mistaken for a refugee trying to cross the border. So those were some of the challenges that I had. It was really interesting. I was an anomaly, and I knew it in these places and spaces where I worked. People would stare at my husband and I on the street. I've been mistaken many times, as I mentioned, as the hired help or the person who would get coffee or the most junior person in the room, when in fact it was my meeting. I was the most senior person in the room. But that did not deter me from staying focused on the assignment. And that was to leave that place in better condition than when I entered. That's what a CDO does. And so I used my difference as a teachable moment. I took German lessons every Friday in my office for 1 year. I became fluent in the language, and I was able to present and to communicate with my colleagues and my boss in Swiss German, and they appreciated that. I remember commuting home from my office one day, and I was sitting across from a Swiss couple on the train who were talking about me in German, but little did they realize that I was fluent and I understood exactly what they were saying. So I let them go on as they were wondering what I was doing in their country and trying to determine if I was American or Middle Eastern or African. And I finally spoke up and I said in my Swiss German, New Jersey accent, "Well, you know, I am American, and I understood every word that you said, and I'm really delighted to be here, and I just so happen to work for Novartis, that's why I'm here." And they were stunned. So I tend to revel in my difference, and I use my uniqueness as teachable moments. Cultural competence is a lesson that I've learned over the years, and as an American expat, I was used to being different. I was used to standing out. And that is not that much different than being Black in America. In most cases, I am used to being one of a few, if not the only, in most of the rooms that I enter, at least in a corporate sense. This same rule applies every day in the workplace, and this topic of DEI is not popular with some. In 2006, I received a threatening letter from an employee who shoved a scathing letter under my office door, and he called me the N-word. It was typed on a piece of paper about 1,000 times going down the sheet. And my CEO called me and asked me if I was okay, and they galvanized security to assist if I needed security near my home and my car. These situations have only made me stronger and bolder in my work. My thought was that I must be doing something right in order for someone to feel threatened by the work that I was doing, which was only to make the workplace better for all. I stay focused. I remember being in the Middle East where I made the mistake of extending my hand to a Sikh, who was another colleague, who was junior to me, but I forgot that in the country where I was, men did not shake the hand of women. I was embarrassed. So there were some hard lessons that I had to learn along the way about cultural competence. Living outside of the US, I had to quickly learn that I should become more culturally competent and to learn the cultural norms of other countries if I was going to be successful outside of the United States. This is diversity. So diversity matters. And in essence, what you are doing, in my view, is leaving an organization in better condition than when you entered. DEI is not an easy career path. It is oftentimes not the most popular career choice. I remember years ago, people would ask me, "Why are you doing that? why are you wasting your time? And I always had a snappy answer to say, what other role in this organization where you have an impact on the people, you have an impact on the culture, and you have an impact on the business? Not many. And so I tend to do the things that scare me the most. And as a mentor used to say to me, if your dreams if your dreams don't scare you, they're not big enough. And so what happens in society oftentimes dictates what and how DEI evolves. And there will be ups and downs, I can assure you of that, like most fields. But change is hard for most people. But if you're up to the challenge, it can be incredibly rewarding. DEI has been my life's work. And as you can see from this slide, I've been involved in a variety of diversity-related movements. I was one of the founders of the Women's March in 2016 that went global. You can see that I've been involved with the Black Lives Matter movement. You see me with Trayvon Martin's mother. I was with her this past weekend for the 10-year anniversary of the murder of her son. And I've also supported a variety of social justice causes that are important to me. And what I've learned is that change is possible. Change happens one person at a time. And I believe it was Miriam Wright Edelman who said that if you don't like the world the way that it is, change it. As aspiring chief diversity officers, you have the power to change things. Change happens over time, not overnight. And what I want you to understand is that there are some individuals that have an easy go of it in terms of their careers, and they can take the proverbial elevator up to the top, up to the C-suite in corporate. And then others, they have a different path. They are forced to take the stairs with a backpack, no air conditioning, and when they get to the top, the door is locked. We, the collective we, have to open the proverbial door. But most importantly, we need to ensure that the pathway to success is the same for all. Thank you. So I wanted to leave enough room for questions for you. Take off my glasses here. Any questions about what I just mentioned to you? And I said a lot. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
In the beginning of your speech, you mentioned when you were speaking at Kane, you prophesied working at a global company. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah.
I kind of get it, but I'd like them to know more.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So Dr. Bailey Baker was my professor, and I remember taking a class. I believe it was the Art of Persuasion. And the assignment was to facilitate a speech and to talk about what it was that you wanted to do for the rest of your career. Now, my father's a retired executive. My mother is an entrepreneur. And I knew even then, probably even long before then, that I wanted to pursue a career in corporate America. I just didn't know what industry, what exactly it was that I was going to pursue. All that I knew is that whatever it was that I was going to embark on, that it needed to have an impact far greater than what I envisioned myself doing. And so initially, my intention was to go to law school when I left Kane, but I decided to start working. And I'm almost glad I did that. I was accepted to law school, and I decided to defer. I started working, and I loved corporate America. I loved what it had to offer, and I was learning a lot. I had my first boardroom presentation when I was 26 years old to a CEO of a company. So my career I was on the fast track for sure. But what I will say to you is that it was what I learned here, what I cultivated in terms of my skill sets here at the School of Communications, really helped me to understand and to have some clarity in terms of what it was I wanted to do, but the impact that I wanted to make. So now that I'm in my 50s, I can't believe I told you how old I was. Now that I'm in my 50s, all that I want to do is to help the next generation of leaders realize what's possible, because that's what I learned here. And that's what Dr. Baker taught me as a young person. So when I say that I prophesized my future, I knew where I was going. I just needed to understand what was possible, and I needed to have mentors and sponsors and other people to carve out a path for me. So that's essentially what I meant. So I hope I answered your question. Any other questions? Yes, hi.
What are some examples of strategies and tactics that you use at BlackRock to implement DEI?
Yeah. So DEI, long before I joined Accenture in September of 2020, they already had DEI in place. By the time I joined, I just refurbished it or repurposed it a little. Because when I joined, it was during the George Floyd scenario. And so they wanted someone who was going to come in and to help them understand what was happening in society and how to keep the employee population encouraged and calm, and to make sure that inclusion and belonging was part of their principles. So I had to recreate a strategy that everyone was going to understand and embrace. So in 3 months, I created a strategy. I made my way around the organization virtually. So I was hired during the pandemic, so everything was Zoom-based and virtual. So I made my way throughout the entire organization in talking through what that strategy was going to look like. At the same time, I built a team. When I started in working for the organization, I had a relatively small team. That team has now doubled in 18 months. So I built an infrastructure, I created a strategy, I articulated that strategy broadly to the board, to the global executive committee, and to the employee population by way of a town hall. And then I made my way to every business function in the company so that there was no mistake. Everyone clearly knew what it was that we were going to do and what the strategy was going to be comprised of. And so now that I'm in 18 months later, we have just started talking about the priorities for this year. And what are some of the kinds of things that we want to accomplish this year? We have goals and targets in terms of representation. We have training programs and things that are mandatory in terms of how to lead inclusively, how to identify microaggressive behaviors, discrimination, like all those kinds of things. So we've put a lot of things in place. We have supplier diversity initiatives, all of those kinds of things. So it's pretty, what we've done I'm really proud of it. I mean, we've done a lot in the 18 months that I've been with the firm. And so we continue, we haven't perfected anything, no company has, but I think we get better and better at this every year. Yes?
Is it okay if I ask the question?
Sure.
Okay, so the first question, how did you deal with feeling different when you were in situations like that? Because I feel like for myself, when I'm like the only Black person in the room where I feel like it's different, I kind of try to keep myself away from those situations, taking advantage of it.
You know, and that's a great question. I tend to meet people where they are on topics related to gender, race, ethnicity, all of it, because everyone doesn't fully understand what DEI means. So I will take the time to explain it in a way where they understand it. It can be a very difficult situation, but I think if you explain it in a way where they understand how it's not only good for the organization, but what the benefit is for them, like what's in it for them, I think they get it. It's funny, I just had a conversation with a colleague of mine who was basically saying, Michelle, you know, I really don't get this DEI stuff. I really don't. And help me understand, what do I need to do? Like, what am I learning? Like, isn't this like reverse discrimination in some ways? And I said, well, first of all, there is no such thing as reverse discrimination. And second of all that we're doing is creating equity, parity, and fairness in these organizations. That's all that we're doing. And you're helping those who have historically been marginalized, helping them to have a seat at the table. So slide over and make room for those who haven't had that opportunity in the past. That's all that we're saying. So I think the more in which you can articulate this in a way that makes sense, where it's non-threatening for people, I think they turn corners. Now, in terms of how I show up in places, look, in the town where I grew up, I'm from New Jersey. I grew up in North Edison. I don't know if anybody in here is from North Edison, but in the town where I grew up, my family, we were the only Black family in the area where I grew up. In the high school where I graduated, John P. Stevens, any graduates in the room? Of 684 graduates, there were only 8 Black kids in the entire school. So I'm used to standing out. I'm used to being the only one. I revel in my difference. I want us to have a conversation. So that doesn't bother me. I think it evokes a conversation to talk about a day in the life of me. I'll share a story with you. When I worked for one of the pharmaceutical companies that you heard about, the chairman of that company, who was Swiss, he invited my husband and I over for dinner one evening, and he said to me, you know, Michelle, what is it like to be a Black American? And I looked at him in the eye and I said, we don't have enough time for this conversation. Like, this can go on for days. But the mere fact that the man asked the question, it evoked a conversation that, let's not focus on our differences. Let's focus on the collective we. Let's focus on our similarities. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. I just have a little bit more melanin. That's it. So.
Michelle, we have a question coming in from the chat, actually on Zoom.
Oh, sure.
So the question here is coming from Megan. Do you have any best practices for creating allies within the DEI space within corporate America?
Yeah.
Question to you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So how we create allies is, and there are more allies than we think that are out here who are willing to help us to create more diverse and inclusive environments. I'd say for those who are willing, get them engaged, bring them to, you know, these employee network groups or affinity groups or whatever you call them, promote education and awareness, bring them along in the conversation. And it's really interesting. I was having a conversation recently with a mentee of mine, and she said, Michelle, every mentor you've had in your career, none of them looked like you. Meaning none of them were Black or African American. And I said, yeah, that was by my design. And that was by my design because I wanted there to be reverse mentoring, reverse allyship, because there's a lot that they can learn from me as much as I can learn from them. And so I think the more in which we do that, the more in which you engage others unlike yourselves and to have that conversation about your difference, I think the more in which we will just have a more engaging relationship, a more inclusive organization. So I think allies, the more in which people are willing to participate in diversity, DEI type initiatives and things, get them engaged. They want to be engaged.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's a great question. So why are a lot of people uncomfortable about DEI? You know, it's a great question. I don't know the answer. All I can share with you is my own experience. I just think people are afraid of the things that they don't know much about. And that's why you have to promote awareness and education around everything that you're doing. But everyone's not going to buy into it either. So I tend to only work with those who are willing to engage in it. For those that are not interested, I will speak to you about it once or twice, but I might not even waste my time there. I will only go to and work with those who are interested in going along this journey along with me and my team. So I really don't know the answer. It's something that I'm trying to figure out myself. I just think people who don't know and who are not educated in terms of what it is and what it means and what the goodness is around it or behind it, that's where fear comes into play. So I think it's just about having a courageous conversation around it and bringing people along the journey with you. Yes.
This is the second question I was going to ask.
Yeah.
But, how do you feel about jobs or internships requirements to like self-identify as like African American or Hispanic or Latino and things like that? I feel
Yeah.
like it kind of sets me right into the application today. It was like, are you LGBTQ plus? Are you a transgender?
Yeah.
I'm like, hey, we're asking you all these questions.
So self-identification, and we have a self-identification campaign going on right now at our company. We want everyone to be counted. We want to know who's in the room. We want to know who's in the company. So when we establish diversity-related goals and targets and objectives, we want to know how many and what populations we need to target. So that's why we ask. It's not going to diminish your opportunities for advancement or anything like that. It's not that you're going to be alienated in any way. It's for HR to understand, so who's here? What does my workforce, who is it comprised of? So that's why they're asking. So there's nothing wrong with doing it. I'd say check the box, check a few boxes, because that's how we get better and stronger at our strategies.
Michelle, we have another question from the chat coming in.
Sure.
How do you not let emotion or personal feelings affect your words or decisions when making things like dealing with racism or other misconduct at work or in life? Moreover, how do you properly educate someone on their bad behavior?
Yeah, you have to remove the emotion from the equation. At least that's what I do. I try to be very even and balanced in terms of how I address issues and problems and address one problem at a time. That's the most that you can do as a chief diversity officer. You really have to remove yourself from the scenario. Now, a lot of times that's very difficult. And especially during the Me Too movement and George Floyd and all, it's very difficult. I'm a woman and I'm a person of color. So sometimes I find that difficult. But at the end of the day, you have to remain impartial in order to make the kind of progress that I know you can make. You just can't allow yourself to get wrapped up into the emotion of it. You just have to address the problem, solve the problem, and hopefully you'll continue to make progress. Yes.
Yeah, it's like how do you like, find
Yeah, I don't, in my line of work, I don't, yes, I am who I am, but I don't lead with that first. I lead as I'm a professional. I am the chief diversity officer for this firm and I have a job to do. So I try to remove my own identity from that. Am I always successful at that? No. I mean, a lot of people just aren't, but that's the best way to do it. I don't lean into my gender. Only sometimes I do when I have to. I don't lean into my ethnicity only when I have to. So you just have to learn how to remain impartial because you're an advocate for all people. And so they can't see you leaning more towards one side or one community more so than the other, because you're supposed to be the intermediary, right? So you're going to have to be able to tread that fine line of being impartial. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
In the information age, where we have social media and easy to spread information, you think it's adversity to well.
I haven't, but I'm sure it's there. I'm sure it's there. I can't say that I've seen an increase. If anything, I think digitally, I think people tend to hide behind certain things and not tell you the unvarnished truth to your face. So I think that sometimes you really don't know how people are really feeling. Versus, 30 years ago before the internet, people would just, you heard about the letter that I received when I worked for a few companies ago. So no, I can't say that I've seen an increase though. Yes, hi. Harmony.
My question is, in situations where we're, I don't want to say where we have to work with people who understand DEI, what kind of activities do we need to better help them understand? Aside from, discussion.
Yeah, well, training is always an effective tool. Courageous conversations, effective tool. I'd say, there's just so many tools these days. There are documentaries, movies, you watch the documentary, you come together and have a conversation. So there's just so many different ways to do that. As long as people are having the conversation, that's all that you really want. You want people to speak their truth and be honest about how they're feeling around the topic. So yeah, the more in which you can get people to talk about their feelings around things, that's incredibly helpful for everyone. So, yes, ma'am.
Just want to ask a few questions about the so earlier you said that you've been working for years and you want to, so you get so much sort of kickback when you're in some like certain tough situations, as well as you may not see the change you wanted, and it can all seem really discouraging. So how is it that you
That's a good question. I tend not to take anything personally. I tend to look at even the small wins as a victory. My team and I, we set very ambitious goals every year. In the company that I work for, we set very ambitious goals every year. And so I celebrate those wins, even the small wins. If I spoke to a manager who didn't give two flips about what we were doing, but now they're engaging in what we're doing, that's a win. So I think you have to celebrate those small wins. And that's when I say change happens over time, not overnight. It's going to take time. It's like change takes time. Mindset shifts take time. That's what this is. The psychology of what we're doing. If someone is kind of stuck in neutral in their own mind about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's going to take time for that person to turn that corner. So you just have to work on them and work a little bit harder. So I tend to get my reinvigoration from the small wins, from my team, from the chairman and CEO of the company, from the leadership who will consistently say to me, Michelle, we are really moving mountains here. We're doing great. We're hitting these milestones, or a board member, or whatever the case is. So I celebrate the small wins. That's enough for me.
Michelle, we have another question from the chat here. How do you redeem yourself when accidentally offending someone because maybe you may not have understood their culture? For example, maybe assuming a handshake was appropriate, but it actually was not.
Say that. I couldn't hear the rest of the question.
The rest of the question, for example, how do you redeem yourself from accidentally offending someone because you didn't understand their culture? Maybe perhaps extending a hand, trying to shake, and then culturally not acceptable.
Yeah. So there's a wonderful book out there called Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. I think it's like in its 10th or 15th edition. And when you think about cultural competence, it has, each chapter is a country in the world, and they have what the cultural norms are for that particular country. So read a chapter and then you go visit these countries. That book was not readily available to me before I went to the Middle East. So I didn't know. I think I kind of knew, but I don't know. I just extended my hand to that person, and he looked at me, and I was embarrassed. I really was, because I should have known better. But, these are learning moments for all of us. So I would say that's a wonderful tool to use, kiss, bow, or shake hands. But I would also say, I apologize to the person, to say, I'm sorry, I just, reverted back to my old American ways. I don't know what to say much more about it. But you will make mistakes, and they will happen. But all you can do is apologize. And just let that person know that you did not mean to be disrespectful.
Thank you.
I saw another hand somewhere. No?
We have an additional question from the
Okay,
chat.
yes.
Go ahead.
So how do you intend to invest that? Like, for example, you talked about your first company, you are so you're just getting into action. So how can you send a business plan to your organization? That is going to take a while for you to assess before you can actually set.
Well, you have to do a diagnostic assessment in terms of the current state before you create a strategy. So you have to, what I did anyway, is I virtually made my way. I spoke to different leaders. I spoke to the employees themselves. I showed up at different meetings. I just asked my own team, what is the scenario here? How are people feeling? You look at employee engagement surveys or opinion surveys. So you have all this data in front of you. You just have to collect it, and you create your strategy and you problem solve around the data. And so by the time I created the strategy and started articulating that, I was able to articulate it succinctly with facts because I had the data in front of me. So that's why analytical rigor, like you have to be able to infer situations and articulate the situation, but also come up with recommendations in terms of what they can do differently in order to mitigate whatever the problem is. So that is incredibly, at least it was helpful to me, but that's really what the job calls for. It's really problem solving. A lot of this is really gut instinct, but it's also the courage to be able to say what needs to be said, even if when it's unpopular. It's not what you say, but how you say it. So.
Michelle, we have another question from the chat.
Sure.
In an effort to educate and move on and not allow it to continue in the future, if one is to be on the receiving end of a microaggression, how should you handle that situation?
Yeah, I would. So a couple of things. It depends on the institution or the company where you are. You bring it to your manager or to whomever is in charge in HR. If you have an employee relations group or an ombudsman. I mean, there are many different sources and channels that an individual can make these complaints. I would not handle it yourself. I would talk to someone because a lot of times we are not equipped to handle those situations, and you don't want it to be inflammatory. You take it to those who are equipped to be able to handle it. So go to the superior, HR, employee relations, ombudsman, whomever. If you have a diversity council or a diversity committee, talk to someone there. But yeah, speak to someone about it, raise it, don't let it go. And you have to call people out on certain behaviors when they are just not appropriate.
Obviously, I had the chance of reading like all the honors that you have. Out of all of them, which one are you most proud of?
Which one? I would have to say the honor that probably means the most to me is the honor that I received from Dr. Maya Angelou. And Dr. Bailey Baker was there and Dr. Lynch was there, and they were my guests at that honor in Washington, D.C. And I had the pleasure of sitting on her board for several years. And I received an award by her, and actually Dorothy Height was with her that same evening. So you had two icons sitting next to each other in a suite. And all I could do was stare at them the entire evening. And I had to speak like I'm speaking to you now. And I remember saying, wow, this is history in the making, because you have two women between the two of them. That was over 100 years of life experience and wisdom and all those kinds of things. That was probably my proudest moment for a number of reasons, primarily because it was her. And I held her, and I still do, in the highest regard. But because Dr. Lynch was there and Dr. Bailey Baker was there, it meant the world to me because of who was in the room that evening. Any other questions? Oh, yes, in the back of the room. I have. So So BlackRock, a lot of our clients are corporate institutions, are universities and so forth. So a lot of our clients will call and say, hey, we want Michelle to come in and to facilitate training or to share best practices or what have you. If it's not me, if I'm not available, someone on my team will do that. And we always enjoy doing that. So yes, we do that rather frequently. And prior to joining BlackRock and before I went to Accenture, I had my own consultancy practice. I owned a company. I sold a third of the company, but yes, so I had my own consulting practice and I did that rather regularly. Yeah. Yeah.
I had to arrange an actual diversity workshop at Somerset for all of our people because we work with both out of country and sold goods and so many people within our organization, like maybe 60 people on board.
Yeah. Yeah.
We dealt with international, so that I was really fortunate that I had function and work with the facilitators, and it was unbelievable. They had groups and different training teams work together, and we had some information, and then we got some great results at the end. We were lucky. This was in the 90s.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I'm so happy that I was fortunate enough to be in that type of
Absolutely.
exciting.
No, thank you for sharing that.
Make people grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I'm just curious, of everyone sitting in this audience, and you're a part of this certification program, some of you are. How many of you have aspirations to become a chief diversity officer? Raise your hand. Wait, one, two, a couple? Okay. I'm just curious as to why. Why is this of interest to you? If we can have a mic or someone, why is this work of interest to you? And even more importantly, if you can tell me, how is this course, which I think I know the answer, how is this preparing you for what I'm describing to you about what this work requires?
Okay. So why is it important to me to be a chief diversity officer? Because to me, it's the only role that I can see, maybe I'm regurgitating your words right now, affect change in a strategic manner that does not offset the business in general. That's how I see it. So I can honestly go into different spaces and walk out, affect the change that I need to do there, and then walk out and then see the results. So that's why it's important to me. And I also like to be in an environment that I think is culturally sensitive. So if I get into a place that is not, then I want to try to make it that. And I've seen this role as the only one that can do that. And how this certification helps, well, it goes at the core of communication. A chief diversity officer, you're going to be dealing with difficult conversations all the time.
Yeah.
Even with people that identify with some of the very similar characteristics that I do, I'm not going to agree with them all the time. And so I need to be able to communicate not only what I'm there to express, but also to listen to them. And the only way to do that is to learn how to navigate that space where emotions are heightened. So that's why this is important to me.
Great, thank you. Who else?
Michelle, do you mind if I
Sure.
just kind of send a question back your way
Sure.
as well? Maybe students who don't see themselves becoming the chief diversity and equity inclusion officer. Any advice on how any of these students in here, no matter what they may seek professionally, how they can help be part of the effort that takes that next step? Like you had said at some point, when you hang that mantle up, how do they take that next step, no matter what role they're in?
Yeah, I think, if just engaging in any or every DEI related activity that you have going on in your place of employment, If it's employee network groups, if it's training, if it's mentoring somebody or sponsoring someone. I mean, there are so many ways that you can engage and to make a difference. You don't necessarily have to be a CDO to make a difference. If you're managing people, how are you engaging with them? And now that we are all on Zoom and other digital platforms, how are you engaging people on that digital platform to make sure that every voice is heard? Because that's the I in DEI. So I just say, think about how you're leading, how you're engaging, how you're leading. And are you leading, engaging, and succeeding with DEI in mind? So that's what I would say. Just be conscious of how you're showing up in the workplace.
Thank you.
Any other? Oh, Dr. Lynch.
Michelle, I think part of the hesitancy when you asked the question about working in the corporate world and DEI chief officers is communication is so broad.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges is you can't just go to the want ads and find corporate jobs or DEI jobs. So how do you make a start? And I know you started in Wakeford.
I did.
Right?
I did.
How do you make your start? How do you take the first step?
I'd say focus on your performance, but be very articulate about the things that you want to do. Like at least know what the North Star is for you. If you don't have an idea of what it is that you want to do, try to make it your business to figure that out. I knew that I wanted to be an executive. I just didn't know exactly what. And it wasn't until I went to Wakefern where I participated in like a rotational program. So I moved around to different areas of the company. And my last rotation was in strategic planning and HR. And so I love that. So I knew that whatever it was, it had to do with human capital in practice. And DEI lives in human capital practice. So I kind of fell and stumbled upon it, but take the time to understand what it is that you want, or to do your own self-assessment and figure out what it is that you want to do. Or at best, start with what you don't want to do. Because I knew what I was going to embark on. I didn't like science that much, so I knew it wasn't going to be that, but I knew that it had to do with business and leadership and management. So try to take the time to understand what it is that you want to do. And then also, I connected with sponsors and mentors. They're the ones that are going to help you to carve that way for you. So make it your business to seek out those individuals who have that secret sauce that you're looking for, a skill or something that you don't have that you can learn from. Ask that person if they would be willing to do it. Don't waste their time. They're going to want to work with someone or mentor someone who's a high potential individual. You're going to have to perform and do all those things behind the scenes. But this is the person that you don't want to let down. And more importantly, you don't want to let yourself down. So figure out what it is that you want to do. Be very crisp and articulate about it. Any place I went in my 20s and 30s, I would say, I want to go global. So I intentionally sought out companies that had a global footprint because I knew at some point I wanted to live outside of the US. So I went to 2 Swiss companies. I went to, I'm now at BlackRock, a multinational company. So I think just be very articulate and succinct about what it is that you want, but also what it is that you don't want. And it's okay to let people know that. So any other questions? Are we out of time? I don't want to
I think we
monopolize.
have time for about one more question.
One more question? Okay. The most important nugget for me is, I think I was built for this. I really do. I think that it takes a certain kind of individual to do this work. It takes patience, it takes empathy, it takes compassion, it takes courage to say what needs to be said. I think I was built for this. And so what I've learned is that I am stronger than I thought I was. From the onset, I think I've grown into the role of CDO. In the beginning, I think I may have been a little bit more hesitant about what I would say or how it would land on people. I think now, and a lot of this comes with age, I think I approach DEI in a different kind of way with a level of boldness that I didn't have in my 20s. So I think I'm built for this. And look, I've been doing it 30 plus years now. It's 34 years this year. So yeah. So.
Yeah, Michelle, I think it goes without saying, we can't say enough for you to come back home to Kane today and give us this presentation. So thank you, folks. Have it one more time for our speaker today, please.
Thank you. If I can say one last thing, I enjoy cultivating the next generation of leaders, whatever it is you decide to do. And as I did the last time I was here, if you want to reach out to me or send me an email, I'm sure the team has my contact information. You're more than welcome to send me an email if I can assist you in any way, or my team in anything that you're doing. If it's career advice, whatever it is, I leave that open for you as well. So
Thank you. Thank you. And as Michelle wraps up, there's also some hot cocoa and cookies outside. Please feel free to grab some, congregate, maybe have a discussion briefly, but we all just kind of experienced. Michelle, your wisdom and tutelage, I can't thank you enough. And before he goes, I do want to call out one other person, Dr. Lynch over here to my immediate left. Round of applause for him, please. Without, Michelle, if I could borrow one of your words for a moment, without being bold and asking, what if, and putting this program together for us, we wouldn't have the certifications here. So Dr. Lynch, always thank you. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you for your time. I think that's about wraps it up, folks. Have a good night. Stay safe. Be well. The next date is at the end of March, March 24th. Be well, folks.
that's how you do it. Okay.